this series of Amarim ותשמ BASI לגני, where Rabbi introduces this topic, which he admits in the Maamer is seldomly discussed in Chassidus, this topic of the tzimtzumim that come before the first tzimtzum, the tzimtzumim shlufnei tzimtzum rishon. And I also mentioned that in those years in the 80s, Nevis Farbrengens had a certain level of interaction, in that, not that people would speak during the Farbrengens. By previous Rebbeim, that was a thing. Previous Rebbeim, there were Chassidim would speak during the Farbrengens and interact with the Rebbe in that way. But in the Rebbe's Farbrengens, as you obviously all know from the videos, Rebbe speaks, nobody else is talking. It's what's the word? Speaking, what's it? What is it? There's a word for it. We're just speaking. Monologue, yeah. But it was interactive in the 80s in the sense that yeshivas would publish kaitzim, booklets with Chidushei Torah, with ha'aros, with comments, with notes on whatever Torah was going on. And the Farbrengens, they would often respond to what Chassidim had written in these various different kaitzim. And these kaitzim, or the Rebbe's response, would often revolve around what the Rebbe himself had said. So if a likut came out that week, then people would comment and write about the likut, and then the Rebbe would sometimes respond to what people had written. There were even certain times I mentioned that during certain years, they would announce earlier during the week which Rashi is going to talk about that Shabbos, and then people in the Koftzim would publish their thoughts on that Rashi, and then they would often comment on what people had written about that Rashi. So this is during this Farbrengens Memhei BASI legani is during that time. So when the Rebbe delivered his Maarim of BASI legani discussing this huge topic, this seldomly discussed topic, but this very deep topic of tzimtzumim of tzimtzum rishon, people had written about it in the kaitzim, and they were responded to it. So as you saw already, there's 3 Maarim, and it essentially went for a full month, from Mitzvah till Tes Adar. And besides the Maarim, there were 2 sichos in which they were addressed it, as well as some notes from the Rebbe. That's not published in this booklet, but there are 2 sichos in which they were addressed some of the questions that people had submitted in ha'aros of Yehuda. Rabbi Mela Tzibul from Morristown was one of those who Rebbe responded to during the Farbrengens. Like he had written in the Koftzim in Morristown, and Rebbe responded to his thoughts. As we'll see, Rebbe spoke very passionately, and as I heard it from someone who heard from him, that he would when he would talk about this whole happening, he would say excitedly that thanks to his questions to Rebbe, he opened up a new topic in Chassidus. Rebbe expanded on the subject thanks to his comments and Rebbe's replies to them.
Who said this? Sorry.
Melech's people.
Melech was happy that
he opened up a new subject in Chassidus. Because of his questions, Rebbe expanded more and more. So even though Rebbe was very strong in some of the comments, as we'll see, but that's how I heard from one of his talmidim.
Which Sicha are you learning? I'm sorry, I wasn't around.
At the back of the Kodex BASI legani, there is.
Okay, I got it. Okay, good.
One Sicha is from Parshas Yisro and one from, I think, Parshas Tzava. Yeah, Parshas Tes Adar. That was the last reading that we discussed the subject. But they actually came back to it in later Maarim. I think you looked with the Rabbi a footnote that was edited by the Rebbe in ותשמ named Tes, right? By Yaakov Kudim. There's a footnote there that discusses the subject. That footnote is actually, it's edited from the Sicha. It's taken from the Sicha and edited. Okay, so let's begin. We mentioned in the Maamer discussed in the Yod Shvat, that it says in Kabbalah, and is mentioned in seldom places in Chassidus, that there are tzimtzumim, there are contractions that come even before the original tzimtzum edition. The Indian this idea says that Rebbe Muvan Gam Parshas is understood rather simply, that there are tzimtzumim before the tzimtzum edition. How's that? In Tanya, the Alter Rebbe explains that with respect to the light of the sun, that quote from Tanya, Parshut, it's obvious, says the Alter Rebbe, that this ray and this light which emanates out of the sun. So it's obvious, it exists also within the body and material of the sun itself. It's not that right, that if the sun can emanate light outward, then certainly it can emanate in its own place. If the sun can emanate so far away, how much more so it can shine in its own spot. It's page Mamalef. Moreover, Ela Sham continues out the Rebbe. At the ray of light that emanates from the sun, while it's in the sun, it's even stronger. Yeah, okay. So just to briefly touch on this, this is explained in Tanya at great length. The mashal there is for something else. They're going to apply the same mashal for some addition, but actually in Tanya it's talking about a different level in GANI completely. It's mentioned in Shari twice, both of which are not talking about the level that Rebbe is talking about here. Nonetheless, the point Rebbe makes is like this. Not that Rebbe makes is like this: that if the sun can produce so much light that shines all over, so thousands of miles away, then certainly it has the capacity to have that same shine, that same energy in and of itself. And if, when the light extends, as it gets farther away from the sun, it gets weaker and weaker, then certainly when it's in the sun, those rays, that light is much stronger. But simultaneously, while that light is inside the sun, it doesn't have any independent existence. Its entire existence is nothing other than sun. So if you cut the sun open, you're not going to see all the potential rays that will ever come out. You'll just see the sun. But the potentiality of all those rays exists inside that very body of the sun, and therefore that potentiality is in essence much, much greater than the actual manifestation of the rays that come out. But the point is that the rays don't begin to exist outside the sun. They begin to exist inside the sun, right? Anything that is produced exists in potentia before it comes out of the source from whence it will come. That's the principle in Tanya, which means, therefore, there's different things that Alter is trying to prove there in Tanya. But the point here is that anything that's produced exists within the source from which it's produced. That's the point. It exists in some form, even if it's only potential, in the source from which it's produced. That's the main point that we're trying to make over here, even though over there the mashal is used for other things as well. Okay, continue to that. Moving from this is understood, good morning. Also in the analog. And again, with respect to the light above. Because, as the pasuk tells us, we look at the way we function, and we see that as a small-scale model for how Hashem functions, because we're created in God's image. As everybody's going to explain. Which means, therefore, even before the light emanates and expands, even when we talk about its expansion prior to the tzimtzum, and within the light before the tzimtzum, in the highest level. But so long as you have some sort of expansion, so as long as you can say, here is an infinite expansion. So if you're talking about expansion, how do you call it tchila b'atmos? It must therefore be incorporated within the source from whence it's going to expand, which in this case is atmos, the essence of Hashem himself. Using the model of the light that's incorporated within the sun before it expands outside the sun. Now, the Kabbalah here is responding to things that people have written in all these details. The intention here is when we use the term the sun, right? The sun here is the source from which the light comes. That's the analogy. So what's the original source? Well, if we're going to go to the original source, because we're going to talk about tzimtzum, vatesham, so we're talking about levels of light that come before the tzimtzum, so you got to go back to the original source. What's the original source? Atzmos mamish, the essence of God himself. The loyla inyan amor, not the idea of God being a luminary. We're not talking about luminary. Why can't we be talking about luminary? The light emanates from the luminary. Why can't we be talking about luminary? Explains the Rebbe, because more, when we describe something as a luminary, we're giving it a description. It's not just a description of a general nature. It's a very specific description. Luminary means that which produces light. So you're talking about a very defined, specific function. And if it's a very defined, specific function, it's a specific title. That cannot be the original essence source, because God's beyond description or function. It says that this term, ma'or, luminary, is lamata gam atar decholos, is even lower than what we describe about God being potential or capacity. Because when you describe God as a luminary, you're talking about the potentiality to produce light. So when you talk about luminary, it's not defined because light itself isn't defined. Like relative to kalim, relative to spheres, relative to chachma, chesed, etc., which is much more defined functional descriptions. Or is less described. We call it or pashit. It's a simple, non-defined light, but nonetheless, it's still defined as light. So even if it's not a defined expansion, it's defined by expansion. Yeah, orders that are in kalim are defined by function. This is a function of chachma, function of bina gvura. Or is not defined by function, but it's defined by expansionism, and that itself is a function. Now, if you're going to call the source the luminary, then it is not expansion yet, but it's defined as the potentiality for expansion. So it's a specific function. It's a specific title, in that it's potential for expansion. But when you say Hashem has the capacity, stam, non-defined capacity, not as luminary, we're not talking about what he can do. When you say he's luminary, you're talking about what he can do. He can expand infinitely. But when you say he's potential, he's capacity, not defining what he's the capacity for. It's just capacity, period. Because the potentiality includes everything. Not exclusive to the ability to expand infinitely, to shine. And as the famous line goes in Chassidus, his capacity includes the ability to shine infinitely, and he can also not shine infinitely equally. That was the Maamre Chafei. God's infinite ability to conceal himself, equal to his infinite ability to shine.
Which is not a description.
Which is already less description than more.
It is a description, but it's less of a description.
Exactly. It's a description, as we're going to see, with less.
I hear you.
So we have two levels. In more, which is it's a description of a particular function to infinitely expand. Not function in the sense of chachma, chesed, which is even more defined, but it's the function of expansion. And then yochelis is the function of potentiality, which includes expansion and non-expansion. And then it continues. Because this potential, that itself is not the essence of God. Because potential, again, is potential. Potential itself implies something else other than the thing itself. Even if its potential is infinite, there's not limit to any particular potential, but the thing itself doesn't have potential for anything. Potential already means there's another step that can follow from me. Either the step of concealment, the step of revelation, or whatever other thing we can't even imagine what it might be. But it still implies a step that's going to follow us. And once you describe it, a step that's going to follow us, even if that step has infinite abilities, and it's not defined what that next step is, but we're still talking about another step. It's going to follow us. If that's the case, it's not the essence itself. So if Yochelis isn't the essence of Hashem, then certainly Ma'ar is not the essence of Hashem, because Ma'ar is defined potential for a defined thing, expansion. Okay, so then what's the source we're talking about here when we're using the analogy of Shemesh, where whatever comes out of the Shemesh is in the Shemesh? So what's the original Shemesh here? What's the original source? So it's the idea of the Shemesh, the sun in the Nimshul, in our cases, Ha'atzmos, the essence of Hashem. Whose existence is from itself, which has no reason or pre-existence for it. This is the most important part. When you're describing something, and that something is the result of something before it, it's not the essence of Hashem anymore. So you say or, light. The light implies there's a source from it. Okay, so then the or is not kadmoy heder, that's the terminology, kadmoy heder. Prior to it is nothing else. Or is not kadmoy heder. Or is kadmoy more. Or what precedes or is the source, the luminary. So it's not preceded by nothing. Right? Even yochelis, potential. What's it preceded by? It's preceded by God's essence to have a potential. So it's preceded by something. So Hashem himself's essence is that which is preceded by nothing else. Its existence is from itself. Or's existence is not from itself, it's from Ma'ar. Ma'ar's existence is not from itself, it's from Yochelis. Yochelis' existence is not from itself, it's from Atmos. And what's Atmos existence from? From nothing, from it itself. There's no nothing that comes before it, and nothing has to come after it. It just is. That's the point here. And says the Rabbi, this is the major chiddush of this whole Maamar. V'sham kol ha'or, that in this essence, which is nothing before it, nothing has to follow after it, it yet contains everything that will come after it. That's a major chiddush. And the fact that it contains everything that comes after it. That's the major chiddush of the Maamar here. And everything going to unpack it in the surface. And when the or is in this essence, which has nothing before it, nothing has to come after it. So what is it then? What is it? If it's inside this thing that doesn't have anything before it, and doesn't have to come out, doesn't have to be anything after. So what is that or? When the or is in the ma'or, what is it? It's potential or. When the or is in the ma'or, it's potential or. That's the definition of ma'or. The definition of luminary is potential to shine. Okay. So when the light is inside that ma'or, what is it? Potential light. What's the light that's inside the shemesh? Potential light. Because it's eventually going to become light. What is it when it's in Yechaylis? It's potentiality for existence, or not exist, but it exists in a certain form that's related to its eventual becoming or. But if Atzmos doesn't need to have anything afterwards, or anything before it, so what is that or when it's inside the Atzmos? It's not potential light. It doesn't even have to be light. It's not potential anything. So what is it? So says the Rebbe, Kisham, because at this point...
Can you explain what you just said in the last inside? Sham harehu atzmos, Yisham mini akel, hayechelis, hamoyer, v'ha'er, uchad mamash.
Oh, this is the ha'ara, the footnote that you learned in Tavshin Memtes. Hayakab Kudei comes from here. Now, when you're talking about the essence of Hashem, which has nothing comes before it. So nothing comes before it because it has definitions of all these things come from the fact that it comes from one place and it's about to go to another place. Yeah. So or is defined by infinite expansion because it came from a place where it was in a state of potential expansion, and now it's in a state of complete expansion. That's the definition. It went from potential into actualization. There's a progression that goes from one thing to the next thing. That's the big chiddush of Maamar. There's in tzimtzum, even in the art of tzimtzum, that you have this kind of progression, right? So that's the definition of every level is defined by what comes before it and what's going to come after it. Atzmos, which is we just finished saying, doesn't have anything before it. Certainly, nothing caused it to be. It doesn't even have to produce anything after. But all the things that come after it are all in it. So all these things that come after it, when they're in it, how do you define them? You can't define them about the fact that they're about to become something, because Atzmos itself doesn't have this. Atzmos is not locked in a definition that says it has to produce the next thing. So all the things that exist in it are not defined by what they're about to be. Or when it's in the Mar is defined by the fact that it's about to become or. It's potential or. When it's in Yechaylis, it's defined by potential ability for something. But if Atzmos is not defined by potential anything, then whatever's in there isn't defined by what it's about to do. Because it doesn't have to be anything afterwards. So what is it? It's just Atzmos. So from whatever perspective you look at it, it's nothing other than essence of Hashem. Not by what, even if it doesn't, nothing's going to come afterwards. Doesn't make a difference. It's just you, nothing else to say about it. Which is the mind-blowing chiddush here. And simultaneously, you're talking about Atzmos, which is non-defined, and yet all the definitions that are about to be produced all exist in it. And all those things that exist in it are non-defined by nothing, not by the anything that's before it, and not by anything that's going to come after it. This is the mind-blowing chiddush here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Started moving Parshas. So therefore, it's self-understood, says the Rabbi. So as soon as you get to the highest level of or, not the or which is Mala Makamacholo, the highest level of or, let's say it's Yechaylis of or. Let's just say that's the highest level of or. And it's coming from the Ma'or, it's coming from the Shemesh, which in this analogy is the Atzmos itself. So it's going from non-defined nothing to defined definition of going to become potential for something. Tzimtzum Mavel is an unbelievable tzimtzum. It's the greatest gap, greater than the gap of transcendence, to immanence, greater than that distance between or and soif, greater than the distance there is the distance between non-defined nothing atzmos to a something definition of potential something, even at the highest levels of what those definitions are, the most sublime definitions of Yechaylis. But to go from that to that which precedes it, which is non-defined, which doesn't even need to have it, is the greatest gap. And it requires the greatest tzimtzum mavil. Okay? So same thing is true. Once you get past these levels of Yochelis and Moir, and now you're looking at Or, which is actually expanding, in order to draw upon the first levels of this expansion light, to the point that you get to the light that's filling the space from which is going to become the later Olamis by removing it. It must be lots of tzimtzumim to get to this point. The Maamer actually lumped together a bunch of different levels, right? The Rebbe cited to Shana Yichud from the Mitzvah Rebbe, but the Mitzvah Rebbe there describes 3 levels in Tzimtzum, Lefnei Tzimtzum Rishon, but the Rebbe kind of lumped them all together, didn't explain them.
The Chafetz Chesed, you mean the Chafetz Chesed? Are you referring to that?
Didn't explain what they are.
But he only mentioned 2, if I'm not mistaken, in the Maamer. But there is a third one.
But it doesn't explain the Shir Ba'asar B'koyach Masha Asad Lis B'poil, which I think is also in the Mitzvah Maamer. But over here, he actually did give 3 in the Sicha now. He gave Ma'or, Yochelis, and Or. I'm sorry, starting at the top is Yochelis, Ma'or, Or. Here it did give 3, which I'm not exactly sure if they're 100% line up with the 3 mentioned in Shara Yichud, but nonetheless. If I'm not mistaken, the 3 mentioned in Shara Yichud are all within Or. It's all within Or, if it's some mitzvah. I'm not sure if I'm correct. Okay. Well, after you have these tzimtzumim, in this line we're talking about atzmas to Yochelis, Yochelis to Ma'or to Or, but tzimtzum ba'or shayir malam makam achala. Now, after you've created this infinite expansion, after going for the potential to Ma'or to etc., then you have the tzimtzum on the Or, which fills the space, fills the void, so that now there is space for worlds. Which is the first tzimtzum, quote unquote, referred to all over in Chassidus. Okay, we don't really have much time to go forward, but I'll just make one comment. Okay, there's so much, the Sichas, I recommend very much reading the Sichas. And actually, when I first learned the Maamer, I didn't obviously understand what was, not that I understand now what's going on, but I certainly had no idea what was going on when I first started. So someone recommended to me to just read everything, without understanding anything from the beginning all the way through the whole Sichas. Because when you finish the Sichas, you'll see what is it of what are you trying to get to? So I recommend reading the Sichas and then go back to the Maamer. You'll understand what's Viller, what do you want from this? When you go through the Sichas, you'll see it there. But just make one point here, which is a question that comes up, and different people have different ideas. Why is Tzimtzum Rishon called Tzimtzum Rishon if it's Tzimtzum before Tzimtzum Rishon? Why is it called Rishon? It's not the first. You don't have Tzimtzum before. Why is it called Rishon? So Balbatasha answer, which is obviously not the correct answer, is, well, because it's the first bit, like when Tzimtzum was introduced by Arizal, this is the first Tzimtzum we talked about. So because he was the first one to talk about it, he got first rights to title, which is the Tzimtzum Rishon, so he called it Tzimtzum Rishon. But if we went later and we discovered more Tzimtzum, we would have called the earlier Tzimtzum Rishon. But that's not correct, obviously. It's not just a question of the history of who got to call which Tzimtzum first. There's this Inyan Havana. And L'chora, it goes like this, and this comes out later in the Sichas, as we'll see. All the Tzimtzumim that exist before the Tzimtzum Rishon, we have to remember that all of that is all in Eibishter. It's all in Eibishter. Right? Even at the end, before you get to Tzimtzum Rishon, what are you looking at? You're looking at an Ar Elyon Pashit. You're still looking at non-defined, nondescript entity. You're looking at the Eibishter as he chooses to be a nondescript, finite, infinite, sorry, not finite, a nondescript, infinite expansion, but you have no definition yet. So all the Tzimtzumim there are all within Hashem being non-defined self. Tzimtzum Rishon is the first time you go from non-defined self to defined Eibishter. Because once you come to Tzimtzum Rishon, now you're looking at Kalim, of Chachma, of Bina, of Das, everything else. It's almost like when you speak in davening and you say Baruch Ata Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam. Yeah. So when you describe the Eibishter as Chachma, as Chacham, Navoim, as a Chazdan, as Kain, okay, so you're talking about the Oyetz in Atzilus. Yeah. And when you say Ata, what are you saying? What are we talking about when we say Ata? You. So when you say you are a Chacham, so we're talking about you, Ata, but you as a Chacham. Who's that you? In Pashtos, and like, old Chassidus, before we get these Mamorim here, it's the Ur. Because the Ur is you, and you manifest into the Chachma, so you are Chacham. Does that take away from the fact that when we say Ata, we're talking about Atmas Mamush? Two different pratim in the word Ata? It's the same Ata. It's the same you. Because before we get to definitions of Chachma, Chesed, Gvura, it's all just you. So all these Tzimtzumim we're talking about here is all Tzimtzumim in the you. It's in the Ata. It's all in you. You as you decided to become infinite expansion. You as you decided to be Mamshech Ur. Once we get to Kalim of Atzilus, post Tzimtzum Addition, now there's definitions of you are a Chacham, you are a Navan, you are a Chazdan, etc. You are Ata Gibor. So even after this whole Hezbedim of Tzimtzum Tzimtzum Addition, the Tzimtzum Addition is still called Tzimtzum Addition. Because it's the first Tzimtzum in God to so to speak, non-God. Now you have Kalim, or big machlokes of Kalim or Lakus, but you get to Abish there as the definition. The way he describes it in the Maimer and in the Sicha later is everything before the Tzimtzum is Loy Adam. Right? The pasuk refers to God as Loy Adam, and then it refers to God as Adam Elyon. So all the which is the Fnei Tzimtzum is Loy Adam, is non-defined, not non-description, non-function, just is. Is and expansion is all subtle distinctions, but it's all in you. After Tzimtzum Addition, we're talking about Eibishter as he's manifest in Adam Elyon, Chachma, Bina, Das, etc. And that's the chorah why it's still called Tzimtzum Addition, even though the Tzimtzum is Tzimtzum Addition. Anyway, there's much more to be said, and the sikhs are not difficult to read, they're not hard to translate. I recommend reading them through them. You'll get a much better havana of what do you want in these Mamorim. Okay, have a good day, Yidden. I think on Monday the rabbi is back already. Or maybe he's not back, but I'll be on Zoom to look at it in the chat to see. Have a good day, Yidden.